I think we're just supposed to chat about US-China relations, so hopefully we disagree enough for that to be interesting for you. But I thought we could start off just each of us saying a few words about the big meeting between our two presidents in Korea just a few days ago. And it's a great point. You know, you can hold us all accountable a year from now with our predictions for how this deal is going to hold up. But so just to start, so coming into this meeting between President Xi, President Trump in APEC, I think it was pretty clear that both sides were seeking a more extended period of stability in the relationship to get away from this roller coaster of 90-day extension, 90-day extension, and try and have a period of more predictability in the relationship. But I think that was basically achieved on China's terms. And you see the meeting outcomes really focus on unwinding some of the most damaging retaliatory actions both sides have put in place over the course of this latest phase in the trade war over the course of 2025. Whereas the US seems to have kind of lost the plot on what was ostensibly the purpose of the trade war, the purpose of these tariffs, which was to secure negotiation leverage to encourage China to make the structural reforms that would address some of the really severe economic imbalances that culminate in something like a China Shock 2.0. Now, was that ever realistic? I don't know, but it seems like the negotiations really ended up narrowing down to just stepping back from certain elements of the trade war. And so you have, I think, China betting at the beginning of this year, and maybe you'll disagree, but I think you have China betting that, you know, if Trump were to impose significant economic tariffs against China, it would hurt. And we know China's economy is already struggling. And I think leaders in Beijing knew that this was not ideal. But they had spent the past 4 years since Trump left office preparing for exactly this moment, hardening the Chinese economy to outside disturbances, especially those that were one might expect President Trump to utilize. And I think that the Chinese side was betting that as much as the trade war would hurt China, it would hurt the US more, it would hurt the US faster, and the US political system would ultimately be less equipped to absorb the pain. And so then we have China wielding its choke points on rare earth components, rare earth minerals, critical minerals back in April. You see Trump folding almost immediately on the very high tariff rates that we saw back then. And since then, I think China's been pretty confident that it did have the upper hand in these negotiations. And I see the meeting between the two leaders in Korea as really the culminating moment where they were able to get Trump to back down on the most damaging economic measures against the Chinese economy. And in return, you see Trump celebrating Chinese commitment to restore soybean purchases from US farmers. But the commitment number is actually lower than the purchase levels from the prior year, and we don't know whether it will be fulfilled anyway. And we can all remember back from the phase 1 deal that Trump signed with President Xi in his first term, which was focused on purchase commitments, which were not fulfilled. Trump has also celebrated, just as one more example, a commitment to cooperate on counter-narcotics. This is a really important issue. The vast majority of the precursor chemicals that fuel the opioid crisis in the United States come from China. So it's an important issue. But the challenge here is that our Chinese friends have sold us this deal 3 times. So President Xi agreed with President Trump in his first term, agreed with President Biden in 2023, and agreed with President Trump a few days ago to cooperate on counter-narcotics. And I think after each of these agreements, we have seen, you know, I think from the US perspective, we'd say not enough action, but we've seen some meaningful steps from the Chinese side, things like scheduling chemicals, law enforcement cooperation. So we already had that as well in January. And so now it's an open question, well, are we going to see anything more than what was cut off as a result of the trade war? So I'll stop there and see what you would disagree on.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thanks for having me here. It's always my pleasure to be back to Switzerland. And yes, I will also start with the summit. and I agree with you some of your points and also disagree with you some of your points. I think after the summit, the relations have already come through the lowest point of the bilateral relations after the summit. And I agree that the both sides, they have the target of trying to stabilize the bilateral relations through this summit. But I'm not expecting that the US will change its fundamental China policy or strategy, that is strategic competition. And I think there is a consensus, a bipartisan consensus in the US of the strategic competition. But still, I think from China's side, I'm a little confused about the so-called strategic competition, what we are competing for. I know that there is a round of discussion in the US earlier this year that some US scholars wrote a lot of articles and debating with each other what will be the end game of the strategic competition towards China. So I think the summit will not change this dynamic in the US, but I think this also reflects different philosophies and the culture behind China and the US, because China would not like using competition to define China-US relations, because maybe in English, competition is a neutral word, but in Chinese, competition is not a nice word. So we are always trying to propose a so-called new type of major country relationship with the US since the Obama administration, but it is refused by the US side.
Until now,
yeah,
with
until now.
the
Yeah,
G2,
yeah.
which is effectively the new type of
Maybe
power relations.
Yeah, the rhetoric, the G2. I think Dr. Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, once raised a very interesting idea, concept in his book, that is co-evolution between China and the US. I think what is co-evolution, maybe it should be, to some extent, China and the US could learn from each other, maybe not in a good way, learning from each other and co-evolution. That is the idea which Dr. Kissinger, he once raised. And I think after the summit, we entered a new stage of recalibration. I have also mentioned yesterday evening. And it cannot resolve all the problems, but it at least can stabilize. And back to the summit, I think the summit also played a role, stabilize the bilateral relations. And yesterday I used the word strategic expectations. Maybe today I will use the strategic imagination, because the summit created some imagination, the room for the both sides to imagine the future trend of the China-US relations. And especially for those working groups, if you remember that before the summit, actually at the end of September, after the affiliates rule of the US and after the export control decisions by the Chinese side, the relationship is really in a very bad shape. But because of the expectation or the imagination of the future summit, the two working groups just quickly returned to the negotiation table in Malaysia, try to pave the way, create some positive atmosphere for the future summit. I think we still have some imagination for the next year, because President Trump will visit China maybe next April, and he also invited President Xi to visit the US. I think the best timing may be the G20 in the later half of next year. So that means we have two opportunity windows for the next year, at least before these two critical moments. I think the two working groups will be very practically try to negotiate something, for example, on fentanyl, on trade. So that is create some new windows for us to stabilize the relationship. And also, I think the two sides will take some very practical steps before the next summit. I think Henrietta has already mentioned some of them. For example, China will purchase more US agricultural goods, maybe energy goods, maybe aircrafts. Number two, maybe we will take some measures to improve the environment for the investment. It is very interesting if you look at the readout of the Chinese and the US readout. The words is very ambivalent, whether it is improve the investment environment for US investment or improve the environment in the US for the Chinese investment, we don't know. But hopefully it is a two-way improvement from the two sides. And thirdly, I think we're also trying to reach some consensus on fentanyl issues. I think Henrietta has already mentioned that. Yes, I think since 2019, China has already put the fentanyl issues into the ban list, ban the fentanyl export to the world. But there are still a lot of precursors which could be manufactured into not only fentanyl, but other chemical products. I think the two sides are still negotiating on how many chemical precursors should be put into the list. And another highlight, I think, is that before the summit and also after summit, I think the two sides has already established a very frequent communication channel. I mean, between the trade teams, it's very professional. And I think the two sides, before that, I think many people in China were unsure what does Trump want from China. There are a lot of debates in China whether Trump wants to use the trade as a political asset to win more more votes in the US, or wants to just to strangle China's rise. And after the trade negotiations, I think both sides understand more clearly about each other's intentions and how would they deal with each other. Having said that, I think we still face a lot of challenges ahead, even after the summit. I would like simply share three concerns. One concern is how to follow through on what the two sides agreed on the leaders' meeting, because we still have a lot of concrete issues to resolve, as I have already mentioned. And the second concern is that we are still not touching upon the core issues of the tariff totally, because the US just lowered 10% of its tariffs on China. And currently, roughly, there are still 40% tariffs on China, and 20% is directly linked to fentanyl issues. And that's the reason why the fentanyl issues is so important. And another 10%, we are still negotiating with the US, try to have another 10% lowering if we could make achievements on the fentanyl issues. And the third concern is also, I mentioned a little bit yesterday evening, that is the spillover effect of the trade issues. Number one, I think there are still, from our side, there are still some China hawks around Trump. There are a lot of so-called China hawks in the White House, but we believe that they are trying to restrain their intentions because they still believe that their boss wants to make a deal with China. But what if there is no comprehensive trade deal with China? I think they will do something very hawkish on China on the other areas. And the second spillover effect is on the diplomatic sphere. I think even we already have these kind of very detailed trade negotiations and the summit. They are just for preventing miscalculations. They are not just for building the genuine trust. And the third one is the divided narratives. I think for the US, they always stress that, like the reciprocity, the fairness, and the Chinese always stress the stability, stress the development, especially the right of China's development. And the fourth one I also mentioned yesterday is people-to-people exchanges. I would like to provide you some numbers. I think nowadays there are like 270,000 Chinese students in the US, study in the US. It is dramatically lowered compared to 3 or 4 years ago. And there are only around 1,000 US students in China. So I always talk to my American friend, you always talk about strategic competition, but I think the first step to compete is to know better about your competitor. But if you don't have a very frequent exchanges, people-to-people exchanges, how do you compete with your competitors? And the last but not least, I think is also very important and the risk points. Very risky one is the Taiwan issue. I think in the morning and in the afternoon, many speakers talk about Taiwan. I think for China, we still believe that the US might play the so-called Taiwan card to strengthen China, to contain China. And the US, they are also concerned whether there is a timetable from the Chinese mainland to reunify the country. So I think both sides have their own misjudgments and misperceptions on each other. And any moves taken by China and the US will derail the overall China-US relations on Taiwan issue. Because for China, I think Taiwan issue is not like trade issues. Trade issues, you can always negotiate. But for China, I think Taiwan issue for Chinese government is like a sovereignty issue, like a territory issue. It cannot negotiable. So I think that is also the biggest flashpoint between China and the US. I think I should stop here.
So right now, there's been an agreement on the Chinese side to suspend implementation of rare earth export controls, at least the most sweeping extraterritorial controls, for a year. On the US side, it seems like there's been a decision to suspend further implementation of export controls on China for a year. But also, I think we've reached this equilibrium, but in a moment where China feels very confident. I think China feels like it stands with the US in this negotiation kind of fully as an equal power, whereas there may have been slightly more insecurity in the past. And so I wonder, we're talking about this one-year timeline. I wonder what happens if, let's say, Trump signs off a pretty significant arms sale to Taiwan. So let's say it's, maybe $1 billion, something similar to what he signed off in his first term. But it's significant. It's within precedent, but it's significant, and China doesn't like it. What do you think happens next? Do you think the deal survives?
First of all, I think Trump himself is not so interested in Taiwan. And I also heard some rumors before the summit that Trump will change a little bit his rhetoric on Taiwan, like do not support Taiwan independence or even oppose Taiwan independence. So my hunch is that, in the next 1 year at least, Trump administration will not take very big moves on Taiwan policy. Vice versa, I think the current US administration wants to restrain Taiwan independence, like William Lai's government to do something very provocative to the Chinese mainland. But if Trump does have a very significant arms sales to Taiwan, it depends also on not only on the quantity but also on the quality. So if it's a major, very significant arms sales to Taiwan, I think of course Chinese mainland will take some actions. For example, we will increase our military parade or military exercise around Taiwan. But I don't think we will take a very big move also on Taiwan, because if we are talking about for example, taking back Taiwan by military, I think we do have 3 scenarios under which we have to use all means to solve the problem. But I don't think the US arms sales to Taiwan belongs to these 3 scenarios.
I expect you're probably right that the Trump administration will be very restrained in its partnership with Taiwan, because we're not just looking at the outcome of this one engagement in Korea. We're really looking at a cadence of meetings. As you mentioned, Trump expects to go to China in the spring, and then we expect Xi to come to the US at some point, probably around the G20 summit. And I think we should expect that Trump will remain quite focused on those being positive feeling engagements. And so in Washington, as you mentioned, there were I think, some anxious rumors about whether there might be maybe not a deal on Taiwan at this meeting in Korea, but that maybe President Xi would ask Trump in the meeting, well, could you just say that you oppose Taiwan independence? Something that wouldn't sound very significant to Trump, perhaps, but would actually represent a very significant change to US policy, which for decades has not taken any position on final status issues. We say that the situation across the strait should be peaceful, that we should maintain the status quo. We don't take a position on final status, which means, it's kind of wonky, but it means that the US says we do not support Taiwan independence because we don't support any final status. China asked us to oppose it. So there's a question, well, would Trump just say yes to that? And that didn't happen. And as far as we can tell, Taiwan wasn't raised at all in the meeting, which is actually a bit of a mystery to me, because in every high-level meeting that the US and China have had for at least the past decade, China makes very clear that Taiwan is the reddest of red lines. This is a very important issue. And it is so interesting that this didn't come up at all. So I wonder if what we're actually going to see over the next period of time, going into Trump's trip and then Xi's trip, is almost something like a shadow deal, where there's nothing on paper, but in practice, China has managed to convince Trump to kind of his own accord, really dial down US engagement with Taiwan in ways that could have pretty significant implications for cross-strait deterrence. It's already been however many months into Trump's term, almost a year, and there hasn't been a single arms sale to Taiwan. Like, if that continues much longer, if that continues through April and then through G20, I mean, we'd be looking at a really significant shift in US policy, even though it would never be announced. And this may not be what happens. As you mentioned, there are still many of these China hawks around the administration, and maybe they will ascend in influence, which we have, because at the beginning of the administration, you'll probably remember this like China hawk community was making China policy for the US. And then that started to change. But we could see that shift again as the turbulent personnel politics of the Trump administration are always churning.
I agree with you that it's very interesting to notice that they did not mention Taiwan this time in the summit, because you know the summit only lasts for 1 hour and 40 minutes, and you should also calculate the interpretation time into it. So it's not a very lengthy dialogue between the two leaders. And that's maybe the number one reason. And another reason is that I think even they talk about Taiwan, if the US would not to change its rhetoric on Taiwan, maybe it's a little bit meaningless to repeat everyone's talking points on Taiwan. China will, of course, stress the one China principle, and the US also have their portfolio of their official language on Taiwan policy. And I think for the two presidents, maybe they want to deliver more concrete outcomes from the summit. And you can see that from the readout and from our Ministry of Commerce. After the summit, we announced that we will have the 1-year suspension on the rare earth export control, and also on the US side, you have some outcomes. So I think that's maybe the reason why the Taiwan they didn't mention this time, but it doesn't mean that Taiwan is not important in the bilateral relations. And yes, I think those China hawks are still restrained themselves. And we also noticed some small changes in State Department website. They have deleted the sentence, "Do not support Taiwan independence."
And this was from very early in the administration.
Yeah, very early.
China hawk crew was ascendant.
Yeah, but we still noticed to that. So even Trump said that he does not support Taiwan. I don't think it is a big change from the previous US position on Taiwan. I think what would change the US position might be the US support the peaceful resolution or even unification of China. So that will be a very big change of US, but I don't expect any US president would like to do that. So I think it's nonsense to debate on the rhetoric, but we should look at the real policy.
Maybe we can just go back into the economic side of the relationship, because I think it's become a bit of an art form to figure out like what is the effective tariff rate between the US and China, as people have different answers. And so over the course of today, I've heard somewhere between like 45 to 47, most likely, after the removal of 10% of that fentanyl tariff. But one thing I've gone back and realized is that a big chunk of that number corresponds to the 301 tariffs from Trump's first administration. So this is when we were still kind of like following the normal rules of how you do tariffs. And so the normal way, it's called 301. There's a process, you do consultations, et cetera, and there's a formal exception process. And actually like a pretty big swath of those Trump 1 tariffs that Biden kept and expanded a little bit are carved out of themselves. So if you look at the Yale Budget Lab numbers right now, the tariff rate, the average effective tariff rate on Chinese goods is 20%. And the average effective tariff rate on the rest of the world is 19%. And we have quite a few US partners, really close partners in Asia. Let's say India with 50%, Vietnam has 20% or 40%, depending on how you're counting. Here in Switzerland, I think it's still 34%. So I think this is another reason why the outcome of that meeting in Korea stood out to me as quite favorable to China, because not only has the tariff rate on China been lowered significantly, and I don't think that's bad in the abstract, but the spread between China and US allies and partners has collapsed, especially in Asia, in Southeast Asia, and in some cases it's actually negative. And so we've talked a lot about the 1+1 dynamic, or China +1 over the course of the day. And a big part of how we got to 1+1 is those first administration tariffs, creating an economic incentive structure for US companies to think more creatively about opportunities in Vietnam, India, Malaysia. And so at least for right now, those incentives are mostly gone. And so that will be an interesting factor as well going forward in the relationship and in what that means for the US broader posture in the region.
Yeah, I think after the summit, there are different calculations in China about the overall trade tariffs on China, but basically it's like 50% before the summit, and after summit it's like 40% because of the 10% lowering of the fentanyl issues. And if my memory is right, Switzerland is like 39%. So it's roughly, currently it's the same tariff level as the Switzerland. But I talked to some Chinese entrepreneurs, especially those coastal cities. Actually, 40% is still very difficult for them to operate their business with the US market. And I think the tariffs on China is not only affect China itself, it also affects the whole world because after this round of tariff, China wants to diversify its exportations. And I think a lot of speakers talked about the production or the dumping issues. I will not debate on that, but I will tell you the fact that China really wants to diversify its exportations to European markets, to Southeast Asian markets much quickly than before, because we think that we are also would like to take the de-risking policy from the US market. Even the US could lower the tariff back to the 30 or 25%. I think the logic in China is also changing. And that will also send a lot of impacts on the markets in the world, I think.
And so with our remaining 1 minute and 30 seconds, you mentioned this idea of like coevolution of perspectives. And I think it's really interesting to think about how Xi and Trump have both evolved as leaders and as diplomats since they first met back in 2017. Which was Trump's first term. I think it was still the very end of Xi's first term as well. And over that period of time, both of these men, I think, have taken on a much more autocratic version of governance. They've both tried to centralize power within themselves and their own kind of cult of personality. Not that America remains a thriving democracy, don't worry guys, but at the same time, I mean, just in terms of the importance of leader-to-leader engagement in this relationship, I think it is interesting to think about how these two people, as people, have evolved together. And I wonder how you think that might shape the contours of the relationship.
Yeah, I see a lot of similarities of the nowadays decision-making model in both China and the US, that is the leadership style decision-making. What does that mean? That means those working groups are always waiting the order and the direction from the leadership. So if the leaders don't talk any points on this issue, they cannot engage with each other. They cannot get the authorization. So I think this kind of decision-making model is a lot similar. And that's the reason why I mentioned that the summit is still playing a very important role in the future.
It's a great point. Whereas the US process for policymaking used to be very bottom-up, China was top-down, and we had to work out how to make that compatible.
And it looks similar now.
Now it's more similar.
Yeah.
Well, that's our time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.